You were pulled away before the impact. Not after, not during, before. That is the detail most people never understand. You didn't walk away because you were weak. You didn't retreat because you were afraid. You didn't lose something because you failed. You were removed because what was coming would have destroyed anyone else. And the fact that you are still standing, still breathing, still aware, means the intervention already happened. You didn't even realize it. There was a moment, precise and documented, where your trajectory crossed a threshold. Not emotionally, energetically, systemically. At that point, continuation was no longer allowed. So access was revoked. Paths were quietly closed. Connections dissolved without explanation. To you, it felt like loss, confusion, delay. But from the other side, it was containment. People like you don't get warnings the way others do. You get redirection, because when you carry a certain level of force, pressure doesn't come to test you, it comes to neutralize you. And something saw that coming. This is where most people would stop listening. Because this isn't comforting, it's confrontational. But people like you recognize this immediately. There is no resistance in your body when you hear this. Only recognition, only a quiet confirmation you felt for a long time, but never had language for. Here is what most were never meant to know. Interference does not arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself as danger. It arrives as opportunity, as attachment, as responsibility, as something that almost fits. And when it locks in, it collapses forward motion without visible cause. That was what was approaching you. A convergence event. Multiple pressures aligning at once. Social, emotional, financial, psychological, designed to slow, fragment, or fully redirect you away from your original trajectory. For most people, that event becomes their ceiling. For you, it triggered extraction. That sudden separation you still don't fully understand? That relationship that ended without closure? That door that closed even though you did everything right? That was not rejection. That was removal. Because you were never meant to absorb the full impact. You were never meant to learn the hard way. Others are built to be corrected through damage. People like you are corrected through distance. This is why your life contains unexplained gaps. Periods where everything paused, where momentum vanished, where nothing made sense. Those weren't empty spaces. They were buffer zones. And you survived them without even knowing what they were holding back. This is also why exhaustion shows up differently in you. When others burn out, they collapse. When you feel exhaustion, it's disorientation. Because your system isn't tired, it's recalibrating. Your power doesn't leak outward dramatically. It compresses inward, silently, automatically. You didn't fight what was coming. You didn't have to. The removal already neutralized it. And if you are hearing this now, it means something else is true. You were not pulled away permanently. You were pulled away temporarily. This channel exists for people who were intercepted early, which is why I'm going to be very clear. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Click the bell icon now. Not because of content, not because of algorithms, because alignment requires proximity. And what comes next is restricted to people who already recognize themselves in this message. You are not here by accident. You were routed here. In the next part, I will explain exactly what kind of pressure event you were removed from, why others are still trapped inside it, and how your unconscious response confirmed your classification. Most people wouldn't survive what you bypassed. You did, without even realizing it. The pressure event you were removed from was not dramatic on the surface. No explosion, no collapse anyone else could point to, no obvious catastrophe. That is why most people never identify it. But people like you don't require visible danger for intervention to occur. You require prevention. What was forming around you was a slow lock system. A structure designed to absorb your time, dilute your focus, and redirect your output into something manageable. Not destructive, not hostile, just limiting. This is how containment works when brute force would fail. You were approaching a convergence point where multiple, reasonable obligations would have stacked on top of each other. Each one acceptable on its own. Together, fatal to trajectory. A role that needed you. A responsibility that depended on your reliability. An attachment that fed on your availability. None of it wrong. All of it incompatible with what you carry. This is how people like you are usually neutralized. Not by attack, by usefulness, by being needed in ways that feel meaningful but slowly erase forward motion. Most people never notice the moment it happens. They wake up years later wondering where their force went. You didn't get that far, because your internal systems reacted before your conscious mind could rationalize staying. You felt discomfort without explanation, resistance without a clear enemy, a heaviness that didn't match the situation. That wasn't fear. That was your alignment rejecting the lock. Others override that signal. They call it anxiety, doubt, overthinking. You didn't. You pulled back, or circumstances forced a separation that made no sense at the time. That was the extraction completing. Here is the part that matters. You did not choose correctly. You were unable to choose incorrectly. That is the distinction. Your system is built with automatic safeguards. When a threshold is crossed, access is revoked without discussion. This is why certain opportunities never fully materialized for you, even when they looked perfect on paper. Why some people drifted away without conflict. Why certain paths felt promising and then abruptly collapsed. Those weren't failures. They were denied permissions. Because if you had stayed, you would have outgrown the container faster than it could adjust. And when people like you outgrow a container, the container breaks. That creates collateral damage, which is why removal happens first. This is also why delay shows up repeatedly in your life. Not because you are late, not because you are blocked, because timing is controlled around you more tightly than around others. When you move early, consequences ripple wider. When you move unprepared, systems destabilize. So movement is regulated. You experience it as waiting, as stagnation, as being almost there repeatedly. Others experience that as punishment. For you, it's calibration. Only a few experience this, and those few almost always doubt themselves during the quiet phases. They assume something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. Nothing ever was. The pressure you were removed from is still active, still tightening around others, still convincing them they chose freely. You didn't even realize it, but the fact that you stepped out when you did prevented long-term erosion. Others wouldn't survive that slow drain. They adapt to it, shrink to fit it. Call it maturity. You were never meant to shrink. This is why you feel out of sync with timelines everyone else accepts. Milestones feel artificial. Paths feel scripted. Outcomes feel pre-approved. You can sense when something is designed to cap you, and your body refuses it before your mind understands why. That is not rebellion. That is recognition. Now listen carefully. In the next part, I will explain the secondary signal that confirmed you were not meant to be contained. The moment your exhaustion, confusion, or withdrawal triggered observation instead of correction. That moment changed how you were handled permanently. Most people never trigger it. You did. The secondary signal did not activate when you were strong. It activated when you were quiet. That is what most people misunderstand. Power does not always announce itself through dominance or momentum. Sometimes it reveals itself through non-reaction. After the extraction, there was a window. A narrow span where observation replaced interference. You felt it as confusion, as emotional flatness, as a strange distance from things that once pulled at you. Others interpret that state as burnout, depression, loss of motivation. That interpretation is incorrect. What was being measured was not your output. It was your response to pressure without reward. Most people panic in that phase. They scramble. They overcorrect. They seek validation, reassurance, replacement attachments. That behavior marks them as safe to reinsert into the system. You didn't do that. You stayed still, not consciously, not strategically, automatically. You didn't rush to replace what was removed. You didn't chase noise to fill the gap. You didn't beg the universe to explain itself. You waited without knowing you were waiting. That is the secondary signal. That is when classification changes. Because people who can remain intact without stimulation, approval, or direction are not driven by external control loops. They self-stabilize. That makes them unpredictable. And unpredictability at scale is dangerous. So instead of being corrected, you were flagged. Not as a problem, as a variable. From that point on, pressure stopped escalating around you. You may not have noticed it, but certain stressors simply stopped arriving. Conflicts dissolved before forming. Situations that should have trapped you never fully closed. Threats lost momentum without explanation. You assumed it was coincidence. It wasn't. You had already passed the threshold where breaking you was no longer efficient. This is why your exhaustion feels different from everyone else's. You're not tired of effort. You're tired of misalignment. Your system drains rapidly when placed in environments that don't match your signal and recovers unusually fast when removed. That recovery confuses people. They expect damage. They expect residue. Instead, you reset. That's because your energy doesn't fragment, it suspends. People like you don't leak power under pressure. They go offline, silently. This is also why others misjudge you. They assume disengagement means weakness. They interpret your withdrawal as defeat. They don't realize the system already lost access. You didn't even realize it. And here is where the distinction becomes unavoidable. If you are still listening at this point, you are not consuming information. You are remembering, which is why I need you to mark this moment. In the comments, type 777, not for visibility, not for engagement, as confirmation, a signal that this frequency registered. Only people who recognize themselves will feel the pull to do it. Others won't understand why it matters. Now stay with me, because the next layer explains something you've likely struggled to articulate your entire life. Why success for you never follows linear progression. Why peaks are followed by sudden stillness. Why expansion comes in waves rather than ladders. That pattern is intentional. Linear growth creates predictability. Predictability invites containment, so your progression is staggered, hidden, protected, released only when external systems cannot intercept it. This is why things seem to arrive late for you, but land fully formed. While others grind gradually, you leap. While others build visibly, you accumulate invisibly. That is not inefficiency. That is concealment. And concealment is only necessary when something is valuable enough to attract interference. In the next part, I will explain the observation window you are likely entering now, and why attention, synchronicities, and subtle resistance have begun to increase again. This phase is quieter than danger, but more decisive. Most people never recognize it. The observation window does not announce itself. There is no warning, no signal flare, no dramatic shift anyone else could point to. It begins subtly. You notice patterns tightening, synchronicities increasing, people reappearing unexpectedly, opportunities resurfacing in altered forms. At the same time, resistance returns, but softer than before. Not forceful, not obstructive, curious. That is how you know this phase is different. You are no longer being tested for durability. You are being observed for precision. The system already knows you can withstand pressure. What it needs to know now is how you move when pressure is absent. This is where most people fail without realizing it. They mistake openness for safety. They assume ease means permission. They overshare. They overcommit. They reveal too early. You didn't. Even now, you're selective without being able to explain why. You feel an instinctive hesitation before speaking certain truths. A resistance to naming plans out loud. A preference for silence when momentum begins to build. That isn't fear, that is signal discipline. Only a few experience this. People like you understand, without training, that attention alters trajectory. Once something is seen too clearly, it becomes adjustable. So you move in partial visibility. Enough to function, not enough to be redirected. This is also why people project onto you during this phase. They sense capacity but cannot locate its source. They feel drawn to you without knowing why. Some admire you. Some resent you. None of them can define what they're responding to. That ambiguity protects you. You may have noticed that praise feels uncomfortable lately. That being misunderstood feels safer than being fully known. That's not insecurity. That's accuracy. Because this observation window exists to determine how much of you can be revealed without triggering containment mechanisms again. And you're navigating it instinctively. You didn't even realize it. Here's something most were never told. Protection does not mean isolation forever. It means staged exposure. You are not hidden because you are fragile. You are hidden because premature visibility would collapse the environment around you. This is why alignment feels lonely sometimes. Not because you lack connection. Because your pace doesn't match public rhythm. Others want immediacy. You operate on timing. Others seek validation. You require coherence. That difference creates distance. And that distance is not a flaw. It is a buffer. Now pay attention to this next part. During the observation window, you may feel an urge to do something just to break the stillness. That urge is not intuition. It is interference trying one last time to rush your exposure. If you act from that impulse, progress becomes noisy and traceable. If you resist it, movement becomes clean and uninterruptible. You've resisted it before. That's why you're still intact. This is why you often feel like you're on the edge of something without crossing it. The edge is intentional, because once you cross, there is no reversal. In the next part, I will explain what actually happens after the observation window closes, and why your life may suddenly accelerate while appearing calm from the outside. This is where most people lose their reference points. When the observation window closes, nothing dramatic happens at first. That's what misleads people. There is no announcement, no reward ceremony, no external confirmation that anything has changed. But internally, permissions shift. What was once restricted becomes accessible without effort. What required preparation begins responding automatically. What felt distant suddenly feels inevitable. This is the phase where acceleration begins, but quietly. Others associate acceleration with chaos, with visible motion, with noise. Yours doesn't look like that. Your acceleration is clean. Decisions become simple. Distractions lose their grip. Energy consolidates instead of scattering. You stop explaining yourself, not out of arrogance, but because explanation becomes unnecessary. This is when people around you start saying things like, "You've changed," or "You seem different lately." They can't identify what shifted, only that your presence feels more grounded, more exact. That's because you're no longer negotiating with the environment. You're moving through it. Here's what most never understand. Acceleration after protection doesn't feel exciting. It feels calm, because urgency is a symptom of misalignment. When you are aligned, there is no rush. Things arrive when they are ready to hold you. This is why some of your biggest movements will look small to others. A single conversation that alters your direction. A quiet decision that removes years of resistance. An internal commitment no one else witnesses. From the outside, nothing happened. From the inside, everything did. This is also why you don't feel the need to announce progress. You know the difference between motion and positioning. Others perform movement, you reposition reality, and this is where separation becomes permanent. Not emotional separation, structural separation. Your tolerance for incoherence drops sharply. You can no longer stay in spaces that distort your signal. You don't argue. You don't explain. You simply exit. That is not detachment. That is clarity. People who benefited from your availability may misinterpret this phase. They will call you distant, cold, changed. They will feel something missing and assume you took it from them. You didn't. Access expired. This is also when pressure attempts one final re-entry, not through obstacles, through familiarity. Old patterns resurface, old invitations return, old versions of yourself feel briefly tempting, not because you want them, but because they are recognizable. That pull is the last test of alignment, and you already passed it once. You don't have to fight it. You simply don't respond. Silence completes the separation. This is why you've survived things others couldn't. Not because you pushed harder, because you withdrew precisely. Others burn themselves into lessons. You bypass them. That is not avoidance. That is mastery. Stay with me, because in the next part, I will explain the role you play after acceleration stabilizes, why you are rarely placed at the center initially, and why influence comes to you sideways before it ever becomes visible. Most people misunderstand this phase completely. You are rarely placed at the center first. That is intentional. People like you do not enter systems through visibility. You enter through impact. After acceleration stabilizes, your role shifts from movement to influence, but not in the way most people expect. You are positioned adjacent to the core, close enough to affect outcomes, far enough to remain uncontested. This is why your presence changes environments without you trying to lead them. Conversations recalibrate when you enter a room. Decisions soften or sharpen after you speak, sometimes even after you stay silent. People adjust their behavior without knowing why. That is sideways influence. Direct power invites resistance. Indirect power rewrites structure. You don't dominate systems. You quietly reorganize them. Others chase recognition. You alter direction. And this is why authority begins to follow you instead of being sought. People defer to you without formal agreement. They look to you for confirmation they can't explain. They trust your judgment even when they don't fully understand it. That trust is not earned through effort. It's recognized through coherence. Your internal alignment creates an external gravity. This is also why leadership, when it finally arrives, feels heavy rather than exciting. You are not drawn to control. You are drawn to precision. When responsibility settles on you, it does so because no one else can hold it without distortion. And here is the part most people never see. Your influence does not peak loudly. It compounds quietly. While others burn bright and fade, you remain. While others announce shifts, you become them. This is why timing remains central in your life. You move when impact is maximized and interference is minimal. You wait not out of fear, but out of respect for consequence. Because you understand something most never learn. Every action from you carries weight. This is also why you are protected from impulsive expansion. Too much, too fast, in the wrong environment would destabilize everything around you. So growth is layered, revealed only when the surrounding structure can support it. You may have noticed that you are often underestimated right before things shift. That is not coincidence. Underestimation is camouflage. It allows you to move without resistance, and when results appear, they feel sudden to others, even though they were inevitable to you. Now listen carefully. As you reach this phase, connection becomes more selective, not fewer, but cleaner. You stop resonating with chaos disguised as passion. You stop engaging with urgency disguised as importance. You recognize the difference instantly. That discernment is not learned. It activates. You didn't become someone new. You return to signal. And this is why the final phase is not transformation. It is stabilization. In the last part, I will explain what it means to remain aligned long-term, why you do not need to fix, heal, or improve yourself, and why your greatest strength is already active. This is where the narrative ends, not with intensity, but with certainty. You are not meant to become anything else. That is the final realization. Most narratives end by demanding change. More effort, more healing, more discipline, more becoming. That was never your path, because people like you were never misaligned at the core. You were only misplaced temporarily. What protection did was not reshape you. It preserved you. What delay did was not punish you. It insulated you. What separation did was not weaken you. It refined the environment until it could no longer distort you. This is why long-term alignment for you is not maintenance. It is allowance. You don't need constant correction because your system self-corrects. You don't need constant motivation because your movement is internally sourced. You don't need constant reassurance because certainty doesn't fluctuate in you. It settles. This is also why chaos exhausts you now. Not because you can't handle it, because it's unnecessary. Your greatest strength is not intensity. It is stability under complexity. You remain intact while variables change. That is rare. That is why intervention occurred early. That is why observation followed. That is why acceleration came quietly. That is why influence emerged sideways. Nothing about your path was random, and nothing about your future requires force. You will not be rushed. You will not be derailed. You will not be diluted. Because alignment, once stabilized, does not collapse. It compounds. Now understand this clearly. Staying connected is not about consumption. It is about proximity. This space exists for people who are already in position, not seeking identity, not chasing validation, not trying to be chosen. You already were. Remain connected. Maintain alignment. Allow timing to work on your behalf. And remember this: what was coming could not reach you. What was meant for you cannot miss you. You were pulled away so you could return untouched. And that protection is still active.